Hello and welcome. So let me ask you, who knows you're watching this today? Your friends? Your family? The truth is that someone you don't know and to whom you have not given permission to know knows that you're here, that you're listening to this and watching this. Most of you will have left an electronic trail to get here. Your visit to my website and YouTube channel will have been logged and stored. The smartphone in your purse or your pocket will likely, since most people don't disable the location app, have pinpointed your exact location, backed up by the device that you're watching on. If you're in the United Kingdom, your car will have been tracked in real time by automatic number plate recognition, and you will have been captured on countless CCTV cameras on the way to wherever it is you're watching this from. So your interest, or even your mere curiosity in this subject, will have been noted on dozens and dozens of different governmental and commercial databases. So what, you may say? I don't care, you may add. You may even wish to parrot the line that if you've nothing to hide, you've nothing to fear. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. Sounds good, doesn't it? Irrefutable even. It sounds like that is an essential truth, unarguable. It's a powerful slogan, but that's all it is. A slogan. A slogan designed to separate you from your rights. Because what nothing to hide, nothing to fear really means is that so long as you never do anything that the government, let's call them the government for the time being, as opposed to the establishment, the status quo, the powerful or whatever, so long as you never do anything that ever presents any kind of challenge or threat to the government, you'll have nothing to fear. So long as you never protest or speak out against the established order, you'll have nothing to fear. So long as you never complain or call the powerful to account for their actions, so long as you never expose government corruption or wrongdoing or criminality, then you'll have nothing to fear. In fact, you'll have nothing to fear so long as you never step out of line, always toe the line, never stand up for your rights or for the rights of others, then you'll have nothing to fear. In short, so long as you are nothing more than a good little consumer who keeps his head down and always does what he's told, then, and only then, will you have nothing to fear. Except, of course, the fear of living in a totalitarian society. That probably sounds fairly extreme, doesn't it? It does to me. I mean, Britain has its problems, but it doesn't seem even remotely anything like a tyranny. And it's true, it isn't, yet. But if we put things into perspective, that is where we are heading. Let's go back 30 years, for instance, to 1987, when I was young and full of hope and pride that I lived in one of the freest countries in the world. There was no internet, for instance, no mobile phones, and the only video cameras were at military bases. If you had said to someone in 1987 that in 2017 there would be 4.5 million surveillance cameras on almost every street corner, they'd have thought you were mad. But here we are, from one of the freest countries in the world to a country where, in London at least, the average citizen is reckoned to be captured on CCTV around 400 times a day. Again, so what, you may say? That in itself doesn't make Britain a totalitarian state. And I would agree. But it's harder to argue that it doesn't make it a surveillance state. And I would argue that it is only a small step from one to the other. But whether you agree with this amount of surveillance or not, we should at least reflect on how we got here. Well, we got here because of a pair of 10-year-olds who murdered a 2-year-old boy by the name of Jamie Bolger. They were identified by a surveillance camera in the Arndale shopping centre in Manchester in 1993, leading the boy away to his death. This was the case which highlighted the usefulness of video surveillance, and we have never looked back. Video surveillance, CCTV, was considered almost universally a good thing. From that one incident, we have become, in 24 years, the most surveilled nation on earth. Who would have thunk it? The most surveilled nation on earth. Think about that for a moment. How does that make you feel? Safe or scared? Proud or ashamed? I know how I feel. In George Orwell's 1984, which I would urge you to read, by the way, if you haven't, as I consider it to be the most important book ever written, the main character, Winston Smith, doesn't wake up one morning in 1984 to discover this brutal and vicious totalitarian dictatorship. It is something that's taken time. It's not explicit, but it is implied that the period of Winston's memory begins after the Second World War. So, in less than 40 years, Britain was transformed from the free society it was into the dystopian nightmare that it became. If we are using our start point as the murder of Jamie Bulger, we are now 24 years from the start of large-scale surveillance. Now, I know that 1984 is a book, a novel, a work of fiction, but it is becoming increasingly credible, and I'll tell you why. We are at present, I believe, in the period of what I will call benign surveillance. By that I mean that, for the most part, surveillance has been used responsibly. It has been used for its intended purpose, which is crime prevention and public safety. But if you think about it, there must have been a period in the book 1984 when the surveillance apparatus featured in the book was also benign. There must have been a period when things weren't so bad, when Winston's society was a kinder and more gentle place. Indeed, it is suggested in some of Winston's memories. Totalitarian regimes don't just fall out of the sky, not unless there's been a revolution, and even then they don't start out like that. In order for a tyrant to get a grip on power, some groundwork has to be done, and in 1984 the groundwork was, amongst other things, the surveillance network. Every flat had a telescreen, out of which was pumped endless propaganda. When Winston is doing his exercise in the morning, following the actions of the instructor on the screen, he hears, "Come on, Smith W, you can do better than that," coming from the telescreen. Therefore it was a two-way screen, with the authorities able, at any given time, to observe the occupants. Now, it is not mentioned in the book, but there would have been a justification for that, for the telescreens, for the surveillance. A justification as to why it was necessary to put a surveillance device in people's homes. Orwell is not explicit, but he suggests certain things, and in the context of the book it is easy to see how these things had come to pass. There are several references to terrorists, for instance. As I have said, you go back 30 years in this country and you struggle to find a CCTV camera anywhere. Now they're everywhere. So how did we get here? To this place where the streets are now saturated with surveillance? Well, we got here because of the actions of an absolutely minuscule number of depraved individuals. A number so microscopically small that if it were a scientific study, that number would be discarded as to be not relevant. There is a common phrase that is often trotted out to justify all sorts of things that affect everyone because of the actions of a tiny few, and that is, well, if it even saves one life, then it's worth it. Really? Is it? So by that reckoning, if we were to reduce the speed limit on motorways to 5 miles an hour, that would be worth it, wouldn't it? It would almost certainly drastically reduce deaths on the road, but would it be worth it? Or would it be quite obviously absurd? Now, I'm sure there is ample evidence that CCTV has saved many lives, but what is the cost of it? The tragic and heart-wrenching case of Jamie Bolger has blinded us to what we have lost. Because what we have lost is something that is quite ethereal, but is vitally important. And we don't know it yet, but it is a necessary condition for the operation of democracy and a free society. Because what we have lost is privacy. So who needs it? What's so special about privacy? In these days of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, Snapchat and all the rest, privacy is a thing of the past, surely. So who needs privacy? Criminals? Terrorists? Paedophiles? Is privacy, as one commentator put it, just for pedos? Is this true? No, emphatically not. Everybody needs privacy and deserves it. You may declare with full conviction that you really don't care that the government is free to poke around into every nook and cranny of your life because you really have nothing to hide. Are you sure about that? So if I approached you and said that I wanted access to your bank records, your phone contacts on your smartphone, details and transcripts of all your phone and text messages, all of your photographs, including those of your children, all your passwords to eBay and PayPal and Amazon, so that I know everything that you've bought, read and watched, plus your entire internet browsing history, and that I will have complete and utter control of that information, including who I might share it with. Would you be happy with that? Would you? Come on, of course not. You wouldn't share all of that information with your spouse, your closest friend, or even your children, especially not your children. So the world is full of people who say, I have nothing to hide. But their actions tell a different story. And yet, we allow total strangers that information. Why? Why do we trust total strangers over our nearest and dearest? I suppose it's to do with one word. Trust. We in Britain live in one of the most peaceful societies on earth, and a lot of that has to do with trust. On the whole, we tend to trust each other, and crucially, we trust our governments. It's been a very long time since we've had cause to seriously distrust our government, not in the small isolated ways to do with particular issues that all societies have to deal with, but in the big ways. We trust our government by and large because we trust the institution we have spent centuries building. Our civil service, for instance, is largely unsullied by corruption, much less so than in comparable countries. For instance, when we have an election, we trust the result. We've no particular reason not to trust it. It just doesn't occur to us that it has not been completely above board. Governments come when they're elected and go when they're rejected. And it has been that way for centuries. Our governments have played fair by us, and we have trusted them in return. Since Britain has not been a tyranny for hundreds of years, we assume that it never will be again. But that is a dangerous assumption. It is precisely because of that we are vulnerable to it, that we in Britain are particularly vulnerable to it. So that is why we need to think in a different way. We need to find a different approach and find the free man or woman inside ourselves. We need to find our inner American. Now I suppose I should explain that choice of title before we go any further, since it will be by now apparent that I am not American, not even a little bit. However, in common with countless millions, America, or more specifically the United States of America, has been an inspiration to me my whole life. Again, like many others, I was first inspired at an impressionable age by America through television shows in the 70s like Starsky and Hutch, The Rockford Files and The $6 Million Man. This land of sunshine where all the women were beautiful, all the men tough guys, and everybody drove enormous cars. But this inspiration, although powerful, was essentially superficial. But it did the trick. It got me interested. As I got older, I began to learn more and more about America and how it had come to be the way it is. And I learned the United States came into being from a very particular place. And that place was the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and perhaps most of all, the Bill of Rights. Without going into a history lesson I'm not qualified to give, not being an American, still less a scholar on United States constitutional politics, I wanted to focus on the spirit of Americanism. When I say the United States came from a special place, what I mean is that it came from a point of principle, which I believe I am right in saying was the first time that a nation was born in such a way. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Must be the most beautiful phrase in a legal document in human history, unsullied as it is by any bureaucratic interference. It is sublimely straightforward and unapologetic. Now, this is not to say that America is perfect. Far from it, very, very far from it in fact. Of particular note is the fact that Native Americans were expressly excluded from the all men category in referring to them as merciless Indian savages, and in the very same document. Added to this expressly stated hypocrisy was the very real savagery visited upon America's black population, which lasted for a further 80 years in the form of slavery, and still another century or so after that in the form of vicious segregation and the institutionalised racism of the Jim Crow laws. So not so good. The election of Barack Obama to the presidency as the most powerful single person in the United States and therefore the entire world has, in my humble and foreign and not entirely relevant view, done much to erase that fetid stain on America's claim to be the land of the free. Many will argue that the current strife that America is struggling with regarding the countless numbers of unarmed black men killed by white policemen is proof that America still has some way to go. Some believe that the election of Donald Trump is a retrograde step that has put America back 50 years. What's for sure is that we'll know soon enough. Anyway, I digress. So I think we can agree that America is not perfect and that in many areas the US can learn from elsewhere, even if it's just a glance across its northern border. But my point is that America remains an inspiration to people all over the world. It's not America's responsibility to be inspiring, but nonetheless, that is the reality. There are many reasons for this, from the superficial that I've mentioned to the more intellectual. For me, the single thing that I admire the United States for most of all is the Bill of Rights. We in Britain have a similar document, the Bill of Rights of 1689, which sets certain rights that the citizenry have. The US Bill of Rights was inspired by this, along with another document which could be said to be the building block of Western European, as opposed to Greek democracy, the Magna Carta of 1215. As a British person, I'm proud that my ancestors were instrumental in being the inspiration for much of what was to become the new United States of America. But I'm also somewhat envious of how much farther the new nation went in defending its citizens from its own government. And that's the crucial bit, as it's something that no state had ever done before. In Britain we have what is known as an Unwritten Constitution. Quite what the hell that means, I don't know. We have constitutional law, but how we can have law which relates to something that is unwritten seems a bit daft to me. It sounds to me like we're making it up as we go along, which I suppose we are. We have a parliamentary democracy, which, as I understand it, and I'm not a scholar of British politics either, as I understand it, it means that no current parliament is bound by laws passed by a previous parliament. So, in essence, a law that all British citizens, for instance, must wear underpants on their heads is debated in the lower house, the House of Commons, which is then passed itself to the upper house, the House of Lords. Once it is then passed by the Lords, it is then presented to be given royal assent, which is a rubber stamping exercise, since the monarch, being the head of state, but not an elected official, has no executive power. Once that is done, it will then be law that everyone has to wear underpants on their head. And that's it. We will all have to wear underpants on our heads. It's now the law. That's how it works. Or it's supposed to anyway. So there is no real limit. Obviously I'm being facetious, but there is no real limit to what the government can compel us to do. That's the key thing. There's no limit to it. What the government can compel us to do or not do. What is so surprising about the UK is that it is as free as it is. Our system relies on the innate trustworthiness and sensibleness of a variety of different groups, including politicians, and we all know how trustworthy they can be. The political establishment in Britain is itself struggling with the notion that technically Parliament is sovereign, with all the talk that Parliament, rather than the government, aka the Conservative Party, must trigger Article 50, which starts the process of leaving the European Union. I say struggling because despite what the statute books might say, as in any real democracy, a Parliament is not sovereign. The people are. And particularly when you have something as black and white as the most direct form of democracy there is, namely a referendum. That's the trouble with British democracy. Parliamentarians, our MPs, believe that they are in charge. They're not. We are. What to me is so glorious about the American system, and the Bill of Rights in particular, is that it sets in stone what the US government can, and more importantly what it cannot do. And that is pretty bloody powerful. That is a real practical defence against the abuse of power. And when the Bill of Rights was ratified, that was new. The Magna Carta and the 1689 Bill of Rights laid the path, but the US Bill of Rights drew a proper line in the sand. You can do this, and this, and this, but you absolutely cannot do this. And I'm jealous of that. And I thought that the Bill of Rights was what guaranteed Americans their freedom. And I was jealous that my freedoms were not guaranteed in the same way. Well, it turns out that my freedoms are not, as I assume correctly, guaranteed, but shockingly, neither are the rights of Americans. And I'll tell you why. The reason that Americans' rights are not guaranteed is not complicated. In fact, it's pretty bloody simple and scary. Very scary indeed. And it concerns in particular the Fourth Amendment, which says, and I quote, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." The impetus for the Fourth Amendment was one of the original triggers of the American War of Independence, along with taxation without representation. The American colonists were objecting to British soldiers deciding that anyone could be searched at any time for any reason or even without reason. No warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause is the key phrase here. You'd think that was pretty clear, wouldn't you? To bring it up to date, the right of the people to be secure in the houses, papers and effects is also key. Note, papers and effects. As I said, the truth of the matter is very simple. The United States government is illegally contravening the Fourth Amendment hundreds of millions of times every single day. And how do we know this? Because Edward Snowden told us. Having said Edward Snowden, I don't want to talk about him again, at least not for a while. He's become a divisive figure, wrongly, since it should be the National Security Agency that should be divisive, and not Snowden, who in my opinion is an absolute hero. Nevertheless, let's recap. So why does this matter? And why am I, a non-American, so concerned about this? What the hell does that have to do with me? It's none of my goddamn business, right? Well, there are several reasons. Firstly, it used to be that one of the overriding principles of the NSA, the National Security Agency, was that it was never to spy upon Americans. That was kind of an unofficial logo. NSA, never spy on Americans. The Fourth Amendment, as has been shown, expressly forbids it. But it was also a guiding principle of the agency's internal mission statement. Just ask William Binney, Russ Tice and Tom Drake, if you want to look those names up. We don't spy on Americans, they proclaimed. Well, actually they do, routinely and extensively, even though they're not allowed to. However, they are allowed to spy on foreigners, like me for instance. Secondly, the NSA shares much of its intelligence with the Five Eyes group of intelligence agencies of its closest allies: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and our very own bunch of pathetic peeping toms in the UK, the General Communications Headquarters, or GCHQ. So with GCHQ spying on me, and then sharing that data with the NSA, I'm being spied on by two sources, rather than just one. Thirdly, as advanced as the construction of the total surveillance society is in the US, it is even worse here in the UK. In fact, the notion of a free society is almost a lost cause in the UK, and it is in this spirit that this channel is my warning to America. As I've said before, America is not perfect, but there is much to be proud of. That is also true of my own country, and I have spent all my life absorbing what contributions Britain has given to the world. This, as mentioned, is the country of Magna Carta and the 1689 Bill of Rights. It has one of the world's oldest parliaments and a rule of law that has been the basis for building free societies all over the world. It was Britain that kick-started modern enterprise and engineering with the Industrial Revolution. It has some of the world's oldest and most respected universities. Britain is the home of Shakespeare, whose influence is probably greater than any other person, living or dead, with the possible exception of Jesus Christ, Muhammad and Buddha. In close to 1,000 years, Britain has been almost undefeated. I'll leave you Dutch and Americans to fill in these gaps. Almost undefeated in conflict in all that time. Britain invented the welfare state and progressive taxation, and most usefully for the benefit of civilization in the wider world, Britain, as a declining power, utilised every sinew of its being to transform itself into a total war machine, to play its part in defeating the greatest evil the world has ever known in the Second World War. And when it was over, exhausted and broke, it transformed itself back into a peaceful and generous society and formed a National Health Service. It's unfashionable to say so these days, but I reckon that is something to be proud of. But there's a dark side. Of course there is, and I'm not denying it. There are glaring examples of things to be ashamed of. Slavery and the slave trade is the worst one in my book, empire generally, and Ireland in particular. Our failure to stand up for the Poles after the war, along with our washing our hands of Palestine soon after. And there are other more general traits of the British character that are far from attractive. The persistence of the class system to infect and undermine almost everything that is good in British society. Our unwillingness to learn languages, our fetishising of history at the expense of progress, our initial coldness to strangers, the meanness of his spirit on occasions, laziness, and addiction to moronic popular culture and the worship of useless celebrities. All of these things temper my pride and question my patriotism, but none of them make me ashamed to be British. But one thing does, and that is our pathetic compliance in the face of authority. We need to find our inner American and heed the advice. A patriot should always be prepared to defend his country against its government. And again, this is my warning to America. Thankfully, Americans have a head start on we Brits and on most countries in this regard, in that they are armed to the teeth. Now, this is not the place to debate American gun laws or lack of them. That's for others to argue. But in its adherence to the Second Amendment, for all you non-Americans, that's the one that basically says Americans are allowed to carry guns, pro-gun ownership advocates, and there are a lot of them, are able to rally round a cause that insists on limit to governmental power. And it is because the Second Amendment, after free speech being the first, it is very, very difficult for the government to overturn it, or ignore it, or even to limit it. To my foreign eyes, it seems that Americans are more wedded to their right to carry guns than the right to do almost anything else. Perhaps that's not true, but that's how it looks from across the pond. Like I say, I'm not here to debate American gun laws, but it is instructive the way that this right is insisted upon and defended with such passion and acrimony, even after Columbine and Sandy Hook and all the others too numerous to mention. But contrast that with the Dunblane massacre in Scotland in the 90s. Of course the country was horrified and the cry went out that something must be done. Legislation was quickly passed, gun ownership was restricted almost to the point of invisibility, from a fairly restrictive point as it was, and apart from a few farmers and landowners, almost nobody complained. Gun ownership was also a very niche group as it was, and we as a population have always had a very low incidence of gun violence anyway. That may have something to do with the routinely unarmed police force. But the point is the cry went up, the government cracked down, nobody was allowed guns anymore, and that was the end of it. Done and dusted. This was the British being at their most sanguine and reasonable. In a way, and I don't expect Americans to agree with this, it was a credit to us. The few gave up a freedom they enjoyed for the common good. That's reasonable, isn't it? No, I think so. But I believe that it did something that we, the British, did not expect. It emboldened those in power. It allowed the government to take advantage of our peaceful and good-natured instincts. Instead of the government respecting the population for being so reasonable, they began to view us with disdain, as weak and malleable and compliant. They began to think that we did not have a breaking point, a line in the sand that they dare not cross. And I'm ashamed to say, thus far they were right. As our government dreams up more and more ways to deprive us of our privacy and our liberty, we just take it. We let them do it. Automatic number plate recognition has been introduced nationwide without a single debate or any laws passed in Parliament, and without complaint from us. We have more surveillance cameras per head than any other country, including Russia, China, Iran or North Korea. GCHQ has illegally and routinely been recording our mobile phone calls and emails for years. And still we do nothing. Why? Why would a population with such a proud and rich history of fighting for its rights and standing up for the rights of other nations' rights, at enormous cost to us I might add, continue to do nothing when our own rights are curtailed? Why is that? Again, it's to do with trust. And our innate trustworthiness is being used against us, as usual. We have lost the distinction between trustworthiness and complacency. Again, that's a mistake. Contrast Britain with Germany, for instance. The scourge of the Nazis and Germany's defeat in the Second World War are still in living memory for some. Add that to the fact that the Berlin Wall came down only 27 years ago, and with it the collapse of Soviet communism. Former East Germans still have relatively recent memories of living under the watchful eye of the hated state security apparatus, more commonly known as the Stasi. Consequently, Germany is one of the freest countries in Europe, with all sorts of checks and balances designed to limit abuses of power by the state over the citizenry. And the reason for that is obvious. They know what it's like to live under tyranny. They remember. It's not an academic idea or an intellectual position for them. It was real. They don't have to be